Okay, I think we can get started. So thank you for everybody for coming to the last panel, which is on representing OCD in film and media. So we have three panelists. We have Chris Bayer, who's a parent of a teenager with OCD and produced the Unstuck OCD Kids movie, which I very much recommend, particularly if there's any young people in their life. I watched it. I just thought about when I watched it, how much it would have meant to me at that age. This was before the internet. When I was like around 12, struggling with OCD, the only thing I could think to do was check out the Freud Reader from the local library, which was truly the worst possible thing I could have done at the time. So I think it's very important work that you're doing. Then Robert Limelson, who's an adjunct professor of anthropology in the Department of Anthropology and a research anthropologist at the Simel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA, and a lecturer in the Department of Anthropology, University of Southern California. And Robert has done a lot of very important work on how to think about mental illness and OCD in different cultural contexts, particularly Indonesia, whether that's through scholarship or through documentary films. And on my first anthropology or medical anthropology class, we watched a documentary from Robert, and then I ended up reading his work on OCD. And years ago, I thought I also put him in the dream panel. That I thought one day there'll be an OCD conference, and maybe Robert can come. So I'm really glad to make that a reality. And of course, most people here know Elvis Coimbra Gomez. But Elvis is a sociolinguist who has focused a lot on themes of sexuality and OCD, and also, as he will discuss, produced a video about OCD and did a performance about OCD for Switzerland's Got Talent. So I think this will be kind of informal. I'll start off, I'll have everybody introduce their work, and I'll start off some conversations, and then just open it up to some audience questions. So I guess to start, Chris, do you want to start just to kind of give an overview of your work and what you've done, and kind of what is some of the hopes or the messages that you're trying to convey with your work?
Sure. Thank you first so much for inviting me. Been looking forward to this for months. This is great. And it's so cool. You mentioned before about dreams about an OCD conference. Seeing what's happened over the last year and so many people just embracing platforms and going on Zoom and in virtual reality, just trying to connect to each other in so many different ways, given, being stuck at home and stuff, has been so good to see everybody taking it upon themselves to share their story. So my family's journey started with OCD about, it's wild to think that it's 8 years ago. My daughter was 8 and she's now 16. So, OCD came into our lives. We had no idea what was going on. We were in the position of, oh my gosh, we have to learn. We have to get educated and understand. And the right therapy, joining online groups, connecting with people using social media to understand what the effective treatment was so helpful to us. And then about 2.5 years, one of the other things that we initially did was my wife and I created a group of parents here in Brooklyn, New York, just parents of kids with OCD. And we had about 10 or 11 families that joined within 6 months. And that was really great for us to meet other people. And Kelly Anderson, who directed our film Unstuck, was one of the first parents. And from day one, she was like, there's a film in this, I just don't know what it is. And then we realized over time, talking to different people, that what was missing was a story of hope and the journey from, things are really, diagnosis and I don't know what's going on, to getting help, how it affects the family. And that was really the story we wanted to tell. And as our kids were going through similar therapy sessions, and they had joined an OCD camp here in the city, run by some therapists at Mount Sinai, we realized that the kids were kind of experts in their own diagnosis, their own treatment, and they were able to have very sophisticated conversations about what was going on in their brain and how OCD affected them. And that was really the idea Kelly had. Let's just point the camera at a few kids, share their stories. They can talk about what OCD is and isn't. They can talk about how therapy affects their family, how it affects them, how hard it was. And let's document that story so at the end of 23 minutes, people will just get an idea not only of this is kind of what it takes and this is the journey, but also left with this idea of, you can have success, you can overcome your fears, you can get to see yourself in a better place. And, OCD may never be gone from your life, but you can get to a position of strength as long as you learn the tools, so like using your exposure therapies and being aware of it and being, families that understand how to help you. So that was really our goal of Unstuck. And just to finish off, what it's allowed me to do, we were the keynote presentation at the International OCD Foundation Conference in 2017. And what I didn't realize then, which I'm very thankful for now, is it kind of gave me a platform to talk to other people, other kids. I've used live social media to talk to another 20 kids and do like hour-long interviews with other kids, some who have been featured at your conference, which is really awesome. And then create my own virtual conference 2 years ago to kind of share stories and to give people educational resources and now give back. So in 8 years, from somebody who knew nothing and a family that was really struggling to somebody that could give back and give help, it's really been an extraordinary thing. And Unstuck in the last year has really helped more people. So we're just thankful that the film has had longevity, more so than we ever thought it would.
Thank you so much, Chris. Robert, you want to share some about your work?
Sure. So in the mid-90s, I was in Indonesia doing some research, and I got approached by Judy Rappaport, who was then the head of child psychiatry at the NIMH, and Alan Fisk, who's a colleague of mine, an anthropologist. And they were working on, or Judy was working on, the pandas hypothesis, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, so I don't need to go into it. And they wanted to, they had a grant that I joined from the WHO NIMH to find cases in the developing world where the infectious disease load was quite high. So they said, can you find cases? Like, yeah, I'll look. So I approached a couple colleagues, several psychiatric and Indonesian psychiatric and neurology colleagues. And I said, have you ever seen something like this? And they were absolutely unfamiliar. They said, no, this doesn't occur in Indonesia. It's not, this is a Western disorder. It's not something we have. It's like, okay. Then I found one other who's like, oh yeah, I've seen plenty, like 30 or 40. And so we did a case finding just through his clinical records and found a number of cases. We did a variety. We did participant observation and person-centered ethnography and extensive interviewing and diagnostic interviewing. I ended up, and then also started in the beginning in terms of film, just for documentation purposes. And so we filmed a number of these of the patients or participants with something like OCD, something that mapped onto Western definitions or psychiatric definitions of OCD. And then after I came back and started teaching at UCLA in the early 2000s, would go back every year to Indonesia and eventually did a 6-part film series that deals with OCD in part. It's not a documentary series about OCD. It's about the cultural context of mental illness. So, a diagnostic category like OCD and the kind of subjectivities it affects in Indonesia was certainly part of it, but it was also much wider social context. I'll just say one other thing. What I found interesting as an anthropologist, a psychiatric anthropologist studying OCD, and it's been, it's been a number of years since. I mean, when Matt contacted me, I was like, wow, I did this work, over 20 years ago. So I have to go back into it. But from an anthropological perspective, the interesting thing about OCD in Indonesia was the uniformity, the degree to which Western psychiatric models were able, kind of phenomenologically, to describe OCD experience. It mapped on quite well in a way that was really unexpected. That I as an anthropologist, we have this notion of cultural relativism, that things are constructed really differently in all these different ways, or in different societies. But when we gave the Y box, the Yale Brown obsessive compulsive scale, like there are plenty of people who had obsessions about, their tires are going to blow out, so they check them repeatedly, or the stove is turned on. And just the same things you see, kind of garden variety OC phenomena here. The one thing that was quite distinct in the sample, this OCD has this fear-based, dysregulation in the basal ganglia, is that how fear gets constructed on a cultural basis. So, for example, that the most common symptom that you see if someone with OCD sees a motorcycle with a guy with a helmet driving by, they'll think, oh, who was that? What clan are they from? What hamlet are they from? Who do they know? And they would obsess on this, and they would ask everyone around them. This was quite common. And the only way you could understand that is you have to do, and I don't think I have time to go into it, a cultural exegesis of why needing to know a social information would be so predominant as a major symptom in this group rather than other places. And it has to do with the implications around things like witchcraft, sorcery, social violence, and even genocide, because some of the OCD people living with OCD there had survived the genocide of 1965 and 66, and that as a massively fear-based phenomenon. This is where about 1 million people were killed in Indonesia, in kind of like Rwanda, in a few short months. And if you didn't know the danger associated with being disrespectful or not behaving in a socially polite way to someone, had real implications in people's lives. And that got kind of translated into the neurobiology of OC phenomena. So that was like a major finding, this one major diagnostic difference that was tied into culture and history and politics in these complex ways. So yeah, I know it's a little bit of a side note for what we're talking about in terms of film, but that was a predominant finding. Yeah.
Well, and it's fascinating, and actually, thanks for sharing it. It's very, very in line with some of the kind of things we've been trying to explore throughout the conference of culture, how to think about ideas of universality, OCD versus cultural specificity. Thank you. Elvis, you want to share some about your work with Switzerland's Got Talent?
Yeah. So that was back in 2014. So I was in the middle of therapy, and I was feeling better, and then I had this thing of actually start to share my experience with the public, because in Switzerland mental health issues are not talked about. Like it's still very taboo, although things are changing slowly, and I just wanted to contribute to that. So I decided to write a song about OCD, and in March 2015, then people saw me on Switzerland's Got Talent, playing my song and crying and like being happy and all that stuff that goes with it. And then I didn't, so like I got the 4 yeses, but then I didn't get through the half finals because they chose like another guy who was imitating Justin Bieber, and yeah, I was really mad about that guy. There was nothing original, But then the idea was that I would use that opportunity of having that mediatic exposure, and then I decided to do a crowdfunding during 45 days to get 15,000 Swiss francs, which is around 13,000 dollars, and that's what I did. And then with the money, I recorded a song. I shot a video clip that is now available on YouTube. And the idea was really like to raise awareness about all these things, and to also donate the money that I would gain through the video to the OCD Swiss charity. And ever since then, so like, I had to work, when I was recording and filming the video clip, I had to work with people who didn't know what OCD was. And so like, we can talk about this afterwards if you want to, because there were certain things that were really interesting. But ever since then, you know, I receive probably every month 1 or 2 messages from people who see the video and they want to talk more about OCD, and they want help, and yeah. And then I did my PhD in London, and here I am today. So yeah, it's really up to you what you would like us to discuss.
Yeah. Well, I'll just ask one question, and then I think we can go ahead and open it up. But I guess just what do you guys find that are the biggest challenge in representing OCD in the media? Particularly, I think OCD is interesting because it has this very visible side and this very internal side. So how do you deal with kind of representing the diversity of things that might be captured by OCD?
I know one of the things that, you know, as far as it was covered in the media, a lot of my initial thoughts are shows that at least here in the US that were around, like there was a big show called Monk, I think it was in the 90s. Friends, Monica used to always say she had OCD and it was all about cleaning. So there was the stigma that was kind of got fed into pop culture about what it really is. And just in general, people just using mental health as ways to describe how they were feeling, even if they didn't have it, you know, saying things, you know, I'm so OCD about this, or, you know, it's just my bipolar, or, you know, so people just, it became in the US, and I don't know if it's around the world too, but just using mental health in ways to describe yourself, even if you didn't have a condition. And so I think that got ingrained into the culture, whereas we have a problem now in the OCD community of just fighting the idea that like, it's more than just this, it's more than, you know, just because you do this, or, you know, people saying, you know, it's, if it makes you happy, it's not OCD, or, you know, if it just because you like things clean doesn't mean you are obsessive about it, or so there's a lot of fighting with that. When we were doing our film, one of the most important things for us was to show, pick subjects and kids that did not have the typical thing. So just about every kid we interviewed in the film had issues with checking locks, stoves, hand washing, the typical, you know, visual things that you could see, but we didn't focus on that in the film. We talked about magical thinking, scrupulosity, being afraid of like objects in the world, you know, just being just right and having to repeat things over and over. So it was really important for us to not show what people expected. And that was one of, I would say, our main goals, is not only to find different subjects and have every kid be a little different, but also to not showcase the specifics. And we really also made it a big point not to show the actual rituals being done. We wanted to have kids talk from a moment of empowerment, and not, you know, they can talk about what was going on, but not to physically show that. And really focus on the more positive, and really focus on the back half, which was treatment. How, you know, what the therapy was, what our ERP meant, how hard that was, and what they required to do to get, you know, to habituate into a different mindset.
Thank you, Chris.
So yeah, so, when I had to write the script for the video clip, that was something that I really had to struggle with. Like, so how do I represent intrusive thoughts on film? Something that you don't see with, you know, with the visible eye. And I ended up personifying the intrusive thoughts. So like, in the video clip, you see me, or like me, well, the musician with the guitar playing, and then there are little narrative scenes of me having dinner with my sister, who plays actually my girlfriend, um, and 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 then and then suddenly there's like this character of different subtypes of OCD that appear in the background, and I see them, but my girlfriend in the video clip doesn't see them at all. And then those characters, they are either like, so like I have like the contamination subtype with white mask, extremely hygienic with the gloves and like trying to, you know, wash hands and that kind of stuff, or like the character who wants to harm my girlfriend, and then I see those visible images in front of me, or the other character who suddenly sees my girlfriend transforming into a man and then having that homosexual encounter. And then, you know, so like I had to come up with little ways of doing it. But then during the shooting, the director, he was like, oh, you know, that's almost like schizophrenia, right? Where you have like different characters in your head and they're doing certain things. And I was like, not really, not really. And then he wanted to turn it into like something very, how to say this, like schizophrenic, really, in the sense where I, the musician, was behaving in very contradictory ways, you know. And so like I really had to push through like that is not schizophrenia, and that it was different. It was very subtle and different. And then at the end, like towards the end of the video clip, there's a scene where he did this beautiful montage of the four characters, the face of the four characters intersecting with each other. And yeah, and then at the end, it was a nice experience to do that. But I do agree that it was really a challenge to avoid the typical compulsion, like showing the compulsions and really trying to represent something that is not visible. Yeah.
And then Robert, I would say with OCD, but also anything else kind of in your broader work with mental illness.
Yeah, because, you know, I would say none of my films are directly about OCD. OCD is a component of these larger stories. So I would say, you know, in opposition to or a comparison to what Chris was saying, you know, in a place like Indonesia, at least when I was doing the work, no one knew what OCD was. There was no language, there was no discourse to frame it at all. It was interpreted through, and this has changed since I did this work 20 years ago, very distinctly because of kind of the, you know, they talk about globalization as having these centrifugal and centripetal aspects. And this is a centripetal aspect that the US, not the US, the West, through media hegemony, is exporting models of a lot of things, not the least of which is understandings and frameworks and categories for mental illness that people take in these complicated ways in other parts of the world. But back in, before, you know, this is in the late 90s, early 2000s, before really the internet, before this global digital revolution, there was no local models. So people who were suffering from this were largely suffering in silence, or they would do help seeking and go to healer after healer, because you have to understand, in a place like Indonesia, there are obviously at times decent biomedical resources, but people rely on both the biomedical, the allopathic resources, but most particularly on traditional therapeutics. There's like tens of thousands of traditional healers. And so people would do the sufferers would go, you know, to healer after healer, trying to find some degree of relief. So in answer to your question though, so the films that do deal with OCD, I did a film, he was a subject in the OCD research, this man in Java, in a film that is called Standing on the Edge of a Thorn. And so he entered into the research with quite severe OCD, but he had multiple diagnoses. There was a lot going on with this guy. And so we initially focused on kind of his experience of OCD. And we did a long cut with like 10 or 15 minutes just about his psychiatric symptoms. But then the film, as it took place over a number of years, I think the film took place over 10 or 11 years, it turned in a totally different direction. It turned to be what he had, like, I think, going back to what Elvis was saying, he had quite severe sexual obsessions and compulsions. And he, as in his 50s, he married a 16-year-old who had a child out of wedlock, which is like about the worst thing you can do in a village in Indonesia, as being an unmarried mother. And so he married this teenager and had a number of sexual issues with her. But then the film turned out to be really more about how that got translated in this complex way in terms of structural violence and poverty. And then his wife, it turned out, was in the sex trade. And then his daughter, who was the narrator in the beginning of the film, who's like 3 or 4 years old. And then at the end of the film, she's 17 or 16. And she's also being groomed to enter into the sex trade. So it took in this very different direction, but it did have as its origin, that film, his sexual obsessions. That was part of why both his wife and his child were trafficked or pimped or went into the sex trade. So it's, the other films I did that involved OCD in some way, again, like I did a film called The Bird Dancer, which is about the OCD research initially that I engaged in was looking for Synningham's career, which we kind of put to the side, and then Tourette's and OCD. So I had a number, Tourette's as a very visual disorder is easier to represent the behavioral manifestations. But Gusti Ayu, the young woman in a film called The Bird Dancer, was dual diagnosed. She had quite severe Tourette syndrome. Still close with her and in contact with her. But she had a number of classic OC symptoms also. But we largely focused in the films on her view of herself as reflected and refracted through the view of her family and community, which was not good at all. She was really deeply, deeply stigmatized and even abused because of her symptoms. She was one of her Tourette syndromes was spitting. And I would sit next to her on a car ride going to heal her, and my leg would just be covered with spittle. So that, it was quite severe. So she was deeply, deeply stigmatized. So I'm happy to say I started working with her when she was 19 or 18, and now she's in her 40s. And finally, she's getting married in a couple months, which was her goal when she was 18. So her story actually ended up for her well. Yeah.
Thank you, Robert. So we got about 30 minutes left, so I think let's go ahead and open it up to questions. Make sure people get a chance. Do we have any questions? And if you want to ask a question, just use the raise hand function.
I found it interesting in over the last few years how I guess it's a proliferation of different media outlets, society understanding that we can tell a more aggressive story or more visual story. So a lot of more media that's coming out now, and I'm thinking about the miniseries in the UK, Pure, some other short films that I found where people can really start pushing it. And showing, visualize that intrusive thought or visualize the thing that is not comical or is more serious. So it's good to see that certain things are evolving and then treating disorders, especially OCD, like much more seriously and more complex and going into that. So I think that's a good sign of growth that's happened over the last 15, 20 years.
Reed, do you have a question? All right, Reed, you're on mute. Okay.
Yeah, got it. How about now? You can hear me? Okay. I'm working on script now for about a 4-hour course directly to those with OCD. And my question's really a technical one, I think, in terms of I'm concerned about how quickly graphics might come up. Scenes that are more stimulus or moving fast, and I'm wondering if anybody has any thoughts or experiences around, do we have to go a little more carefully or slowly or introduce graphics gradually in order to not overstimulate the viewer? And then secondly, other than what you were saying earlier, I'm going to show with characters the scenes of hand washing or checking or whatever, but we're also going to carry those characters all the way through to successful transition. So anyway, I'll stop around that, but if anybody has any thoughts about what I'm talking about, that'd be great.
Yeah, if I may, I'm posting a link on YouTube. Under COVID, we released a bunch of our films, and so in this Affliction series, a 6-part film series, we used multiple different graphical representations. So we did montages, we did kinetic typography, we did animated drawings. We used a range of graphical forms of representation. So if you go to the links here on YouTube, go to the films on YouTube, the Afflictions films, in particular, a film called Memory of My Face, which is not about OCD, it's about schizoaffective disorder, if you want to call it that. That has interesting graphics. A film called Kites and Monsters, which is about a young boy with actually, oh, I forgot. Yeah, he has quite distinct OC phenomena, and you see him at age 5, 8, 15, and 19. So you see this development over time, and there's some interesting. He is a big artist. He was an artist as a child, and we show the kind of transitions in his artistic productions over that 14-year period. So I think there's a whole range, Reed, of ways you could use graphics really productively to represent a range of things.
But what about overstimulation? That's my concern. Did you notice, or did you make decisions around how rapidly things came in, or did you keep things relatively simple and gradual as you introduce them?
You mean overstimulation on the part of the viewer?
Yes.
Yeah, it's
overwhelming them.
Yeah, I think there's a generational difference. I think millennials and digital natives. If you look at the evolution of editing, the editing has gotten progressively more fast and frenetic over the last 20 or 30 years. And I think for people of our generation, older, it can be overwhelming. I think for younger people, probably a bit less, just because it's just part of their everyday experience. Yeah.
Good. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that was going to be my answer too, that it's I think gradual is helpful so people know what's coming. I also find one way that if you find a scene might be a little triggering or more aggressive, Sometimes voiceover of that scene or setting up that scene helps people understand what's coming. Like visually, they can see maybe in their mind what's going to be shown, and then when they see it, it's not as too shocking. But also editing too. I think some of your question relies on your editor and who's going to put it together. If it's going to be something that is more frenetic and fast paced, people might be aware of that and used to it. If it's more slow in building, it's just like how the entire piece goes through.
I was also going to add, it actually also depends on what kind of effect that you want to do. So like, I wouldn't say that, if it's going super fast, that might be overwhelming per se on the younger generation, unless they have, maybe like epileptic, problems where like the fast pacing of the images might provoke some seizures. But what I was also thinking about, like, it also depends whether you want to be transparent, like at the beginning of your movie and say trigger warning or like sexual images, whatever. Because at the end of the day, it's really like the content of the image that will be triggering for the person with OCD. So if I think about the TV show Pure, that really had graphic sexual images of naked people in the subway, right? And sometimes they were like very short, like really a snippet, and then other times were longer. But then for people who had like that kind of sexual obsessions, that was really, really triggering. So I think it's a question of who is the audience of your movie, and also whether you want to warn them at the beginning of the movie. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Juliana.
Hello, hi everyone. Thank you for being here. So my question for the panelists is mostly like what has been the most impactful part of your, whether it was like Elvis, you were singing in public on television, in like subtitles in different languages, and then having to connect with a judge who didn't understand your lyrics. And Chris, I mean, you have a whole, like a brave cast of young children. Robert, you've like produced a slew of films that really have interesting encounters with anxiety disorders. But I'm wondering what has been the most impactful part of your work, or what you believe to be the most impactful, but also because given that the theme of this conference in particular is the future of critical OCD studies, what's next for you?
Thank you, Juliana.
So, that's a very good question. Okay, so like, if I think about impact, like first self-impact. So I think like the whole process for me was very therapeutic first. So like I remember being in the process of recording the song, and like being 24 hours in a studio and hearing the song again and again and again and again and again, like really put me back into like my head when I was obsessing about my thoughts. And so like it had like this very strange effect on me of going back into my experience of OCD through a different perspective, and then also externalize everything for a global audience to a certain extent. And then also like I also played with the fact that, as you said, like, well, I was singing for an audience who mostly spoke German, and I was singing in English, and I didn't really speak about what I went through. So I was very general in my song, but for an English speaker, I think you would really understand what kind of OCD that I had when I repeated 3 times, am I queer, am I queer, am I queer? But like for a German audience who doesn't understand what queer means, well, that was, my way of navigating the disclosure aspect. But then also like, if I think about impact on others, like I receive so many mails from people from all over the world, saying, thank you for telling your story. The song was awesome. Like, do you have any advice on how to deal with the intrusive thoughts, blah, blah, blah. And then I always offered them, help in finding the most appropriate treatment, or like therapists in their area where they're living and so forth. So that was really important. And then about the future, I just hope, like in terms of film, I just really hope that people start, being more faithful to the OCD experience. So like, the link that I just posted in on the chat like a couple of minutes ago, this is a TV show that comes out soon in the UK, and they're still relying on the same stereotypes about the washing, the perfectionist monk type of character. And it's like, we're in 2021 where other series have done a better job. Like, why is it still so difficult for people to understand what OCD is? Yeah.
For myself, I think what has been great about seeing the kids in the film go from being very reluctant and not 100% sure if this was going to work for them, like, sharing their story was going to be something helpful, and empowering them to like share their story more, and have it be more of an empowering thing for them, and realizing it was a good thing to share. For me personally, the film, watching kids, especially my daughter, like face her fears and go through these hard challenges has really put my life in perspective, and you're inspired by them. And it's like, if they can do this, then I can do this. And in certain ways, it's like, if she can do these really hard things and work on her fear of what, of a tree or water, then why am I so hesitant to go talk to my boss and confront him about something that happened at work, or to take an assignment that I might be scared I might not do well in, and that's how it's really affected my life. And so, there's two, and I am thankful every time somebody reaches out and says, thank you for showing this, or I wish this was around as a kid, and how many we thought we were making something for kids and families, and the fact that people of all ages have found it useful, and also therapists have used it to open up a conversation, or that people who don't know what it is, families have used it to open conversations within their own family, like, this is really what it is really has been, super incredibly rewarding for us.
Yeah, when I started doing these films, I thought my audience was mental health professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers. And when I showed some of the earlier cuts of films, I realized that that wasn't the audience. The stuff was too, it's anthropological, it's too bizarre, it's too distinct from people's everyday realities. And but the films themselves have had a huge impact in Indonesia proper, fourth largest country in the world. They've gotten hundreds of thousands of views, and sparked a lot of conversations. That's very gratifying that it's having a positive effect in the place where it comes from. In terms, actually, this goes back a little bit back to Reed's question. I've been engaged in a couple different projects recently. One that started back in maybe 2012 is the exploration of autism, which obviously has links with OC experience. And we did two films on two kind of case studies, kind of a good and a bad, not really or positive and negative sort of outcome, with people, living with autism or neurodiverse in Indonesia. But as part of that, we've been exploring sensory ethnography. So we did a project on of all things, Balinese cockfight. For the anthropologists here, if there are any, will know that was a big deal. Famous essay by Clifford Geertz. And so we did a sensory ethnography of, no voiceover, no narration, just kind of a structured sight and sound for the cockfight. And so we took those same ideas and we're thinking through how to do a sensory ethnography of autism in Indonesia. So they're very kind of specific places and activities that people engage with that are very culturally distinct. And then we're thinking, just how do we shoot that what sort of, because the sensorium is really distinct, and with people who are neurodiverse, it's quite in some cases quite distinct from the kind of culturally modal forms of perception and sensorium. So like, how do you deal with that, and how do you represent someone who can only operate in one sensory modality? I've had people with autism tell me, like, I can just see things. If I'm seeing something, I do not hear anything. If I close my eyes and not see something, my ears kind of turn on and I can hear. So how do you represent that? How do you represent the pretty strong aversion to sounds, or the obsessive interest in, like, I had a autism subject who just loved rotating fans and just spent hours looking at the fan. So how do you represent those visually to represent the people's subjectivity? And so we're thinking kind of through how that's done, but it really, in my field, that has not been done yet. So that's where we're going. Yeah.
Thank you. Holly.
I'm actually unmuted. So one thing in my area of research that's becoming much more, I'm going to say, popular, is having like a lived experience advisory panel for research to make sure that, I mean, it's probably quite obvious why, but just to make sure that what's being done is useful to people with OCD. And I understand that some projects, I know that Pure, for example, I think that was produced in collaboration with OCD Action, is that right? Yeah, just to make sure that it was actually helpful. Whereas I wonder whether the program that Elvis was talking about, with the kind of the obsession about checking and cleaning things and kind of reinforcing those stereotypes, whether that kind of thing would have had an advisory panel. But I just wonder what the panel thinks about, including lived experience people within your research. Not your research, sorry, obsessed with research, within your filming.
For us, it was incredibly important. The first thing we did once we had the idea for the film, it was like, okay, who are going to be our advisory board? So we reached out to the OCD Foundation here in the US, and they immediately said yes. And one of their board members was on our advisory, as well as two prominent therapists that we had, that they connected us to. And we also connected with someone whose name is Jenny Jaffe, that started a project here in the US years ago called You Are Okay. And that was important to have somebody who not only had the lived experience, but also like a filmmaking background as far as storytelling. So it was so important. And whenever we had rough cuts, they were the ones are we covering this accurately? Did we get this right? And if we got the okay from them, we knew we were, then we could share it with a larger audience. So at many stages, at the rough cut stage, at the final cut stage, and even at like some of the, and when we came down to like what title cards that this is accurate, we relied on our advisory board.
I mean, lived experience is central to our film projects. I mean, they're not all, but the majority of my films focus on individuals' lived experience and subjectivity over time in a particular place. So yeah, it's the core part of my work in film. It's a core part. Yeah, really important.
I mean, for me, I think it's evident. Like, I wrote the song, I wrote the script, but yeah, like just mentioning, because you mentioned that for Pure Day, I actually had OCD Action intervening, and it's true that they had David Veal, who served as an advisory board. And when I talked to him about it, he was like, he wanted to actually have the pedophilic thoughts in the series, but then the TV channel, they were like, that's too much, like, and we're not going down that route because people will then misunderstand stuff more. And so I also think like that there is like a certain how to say, like certain power structures that also limit what gets to be seen on television or film more widely. Yeah.
Eva.
Hiya. This is quite a specific question for Robert, sorry, and then I can ask a general one if you want. I was just interested when looking at like the film titles and stuff, and one of them is about like ritual burdens in manic depression ritual. And I'm quite interested in this idea of ritual because compulsive ritual sort of throughout the history became compulsive behavior and then it became compulsions. But like, because I'm a historian, some of the early texts that I look at, you know, they use this term ritual a lot. And I can understand why, because, you know, the behavior looks ritualistic, but I was wondering whether, because you've clearly identified ritual in other kind of spaces and in relation to other mental disorders, and I was wondering what you think perhaps has been lost in the kind of Western idea of OCD that perhaps is embodied in the ritual, or what we can learn from the way that ritual as a concept is used in kind of different spaces relating to mental disorders. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, there's the individualized, rituals involving OC phenomenology. That is not actually what the film you referenced is about. We live in this really de-ritualized society. For people who've worked in other places like, in Melanesia, New Guinea, or in Indonesia, where ritual is in a lived experience, a minute by minute activity, like in Bali. In fact, I have Balinese colleagues who call it ritual slavery. Women are producing ritual objects sometimes all day long, and they're doing prayers and ritual activities on an hourly basis, sometimes putting offerings down for the earth spirits, putting offerings at the family temple, etc. So that film is about how something that can be seen as quite beautiful in some ways, or life affirming, can be a form of massive social stressor, because if you don't do the rituals properly, there are all these cosmological implications for not just your life here, but your life in this. Bali has this cyclical notion of reincarnation, that you get reincarnated multiple generations later into your own family lineage. So the soul in my body, if I was Balinese, would descend from my great-great-grandfather, and then when I die, it would descend to my great-great-grandson, something like that. And so if you don't do the rituals properly, there are these terrible cosmological implications. You're not going to be properly reincarnated, or you may be reincarnated into a really bad incarnation. So this is how kind of culture enters into people's own subjectivity, and then shapes and then forces them, in some ways, I shouldn't really use that term, but forces them to do these ritual activities. So there's this complex interaction, obviously, between the individualized ritual practices and the idiosyncratic, non-kind of culturally typical ritual practices that are involved in OC phenomenology and subjectivity, and the rituals that are culturally normative and engaged in by many people in a community. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, because ritual goes, Freud made those direct links between ritual and OC phenomenology, and it's notions of scrupulosity, etc., all involve that. But the ritual I was talking about was culturally normative ritual.
Actually, just to follow up on that, that it seems to me that description of the culturally normative rituals, in some ways, is so close to OCD. Kind of the way that, and not to say that they're the same, but I'm just wondering about this idea of, if you don't do the ritual right, there's all these consequences. I think that it's almost as if OCD is one of the few spaces in a de-ritualized society where people are really struggling with the idea that a ritual performed incorrectly might have these severe consequences. But we have about 4 minutes left. Does anybody have another question they want to ask? I'll ask just a question. about what are the kind of ethical challenges of, I guess, producing, films about OCD or mental illness? I mean, are there things that you struggle with or that you caution other people about who might be thinking about? We've talked about that some, but just the actual process of producing films about OCD, whether about your experience or other people's.
I guess I'll go first. Kelly and myself, we talked a lot about, because our subjects were kids, they were 13 and under. How did we or do we want to show them struggling or in moments of crisis? And how we immediately realized that was not something we wanted to do. We wanted to give them, come with allow them to come from a position of strength. It didn't feel right to us to kind of put them in situations where they might be triggered and focus on that, like sensationalizing things. And that was one of the things that we discussed just in planning it. And once you kind of get some of those things out of the way, it helps you in the direction of what the story you want to tell. It helped us kind of understand what the beginning and the middle and the end, and how we might be able to cover some of those moments of fear and the anxieties that they had through interviews and through like B-roll, but we really just didn't. This wasn't about sensationalizing what they were going through. This is about really showing that this is the fear they had, but then this is how they were able to kind of overcome it.
I just posted, I've written fairly extensively on the ethical implications of doing this kind of work. So in my book I published a few years ago has a chapter on ethics. I would just say, for doing this kind of work, because we don't have time to get into the actual content, ethical considerations are involved in, pre-production, production, and post-production. I mean, in every aspect, you need to be thinking through the ethical implications of what you're engaged in. Beyond IRB stuff, it's like there's really serious implications for your participants' lives and experience. And so that has to be at the forefront, and certainly been at the forefront of our consciousness, ethical considerations. Yeah. So, but there's a chapter in this, and I have a book coming out this year or next year, whenever it's done, that also has more ethical discussions in it.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, ethics, super important. So I don't have the experience of thinking about ethics about filming other people with mental health issues. But I think it also goes, to the same thing that I said before. Like, if you want to represent something as truthfully as possible, you also have to have respect for the population that you're representing on screen. So I think that's where I would see the ethical implications coming in. Of course, you don't have like a real impact, like, a physical impact on people, but you do have the responsibility to represent that group in the most faithful way possible.
Thank you. And so that's our time, but I want to thank all our presenters, both in this panel and just through the whole conference. It's been a wonderful experience to have so many people bring different perspectives about OCD and think about what the future of academic work, arts, film might be for OCD, and to build the groundwork also for more community around it. So I really appreciate everybody taking part, and we have the social hour still. So Elvis, because we're on a different Zoom, could you put the link in for that?
Yeah, so I just put it on the chat. Click on it, and once you are on the platform, you have to zoom out to see where the people are, because like people get lost. Like I see people getting lost on the platform because of that. And yeah, it was a really interesting conference. I'm extremely glad to have had such high quality presentations and questions and discussions, and it was really exciting. And if anybody wants to organize the 3rd edition in 2 years' time, just drop us a mail and we'll have a chat about it. Thank you.
Matthew, Elvis, thank you so much for putting this on over 2 days. I know it takes a lot of time and effort behind the scenes to put on anything. So great job, y'all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elvis and Matt. You've done a wonderful job, and it's been such a kind of creative space. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you in the Wonder Room.
Yes, see you there.